Canaveral Groves is a quiet pocket of Brevard County, Florida. Pine scrub and sandy driveways, porch lights that blink on early, and nights so still you can hear the same train twice. On Allen Shepherd Avenue, the small ranch house with the chain-link fence fit the neighborhood. That home belonged to 3 generations of the Terwilliger family, and the man who loved one of them. Inside were the rhythms of a regular life. A grandmother who kept the calendar straight, a mother who ran the day-to-day with a stubborn kindness, a teenager who was figuring herself out one text and playlist at a time, and an adult partner who fixed what needed fixing. On most nights, the loudest sound was the TV or the dryer thumping a pair of sneakers. On March 1st, 2023, the loudest sound was something else. Just after 1 a.m., 2 small boys in that house, 6 and 9, were faced with a problem no child should ever have to name. They were awake, they were afraid, and their world had changed in a single burst of noise that didn't belong to a neighborhood like this. They did the bravest, most practical thing any child can do. They called for help. Deputies from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office rolled hard toward Allen Shepherd Avenue, lights cutting the dark, radios leading the way. The first units found 2 children alive, and a scene that turned an ordinary Florida night into something that looked like a crime scene diagram. What had been a family home was now a hallway of evidence. 4 people were down. 4 people were not getting back up. The next minutes were the mixture first responders know too well, medics moving faster than gravity, deputies building a perimeter and pushing calm into the chaos, a supervisor calling for more hands, more lights, and the team that turns a room into facts that can stand in court. By dawn, the names began to settle into the air, each with a story attached to a life that was supposed to keep going. Glenda Mae Terwilliger, 63, the grandmother whose steadiness was the house's spine. Constance Marie Terwilliger, 35, mother, doer, the person people in the family called when the daily problems needed solving. Kiara Terwilliger, 15, small and fierce, a teenager whose messages were full of plans that extended just far enough to feel like a future. And Michael Andrew Watson, 36, the man who moved through the house like a second pair of hands, the kind of partner who made ordinary days easier. 4 lives, 4 rooms of absence, 1 address that would be said on newscasts all day as if a street could explain anything. It couldn't. The first explanations came in the form of actions. The sheriff's office tightened the scene, widened the search, and listened to the children. A suspect description took shape, not from guesswork, but from the most obvious, painful math there is in cases like this. When violence is this targeted, 4 people inside a home, at night with 2 little boys spared, it often points inward towards someone the family knew. Within hours, deputies had a name and a radius. Before lunchtime, a 36-year-old man was in cuffs on a charge sheet that would soon use the heaviest words Florida law owns. His name was Domenico Claude Gigante. He was not a stranger to that address. He was not a stranger to that family. And if you're already thinking about motive, you're thinking like a detective. The story that would emerge in the following days is the one you've heard too many times, each time with different uniforms, different porch lights, and the same terrible shape. A man whose relationship to a family fractures, a daughter who sets a boundary, a house that should be the safest place on earth, and a decision, armed, deliberate, that turns the inside of a home into a scene investigators will have to diagram with numbers and arrows to make a jury believe the scale of what happened. But that's for later. Part 1 belongs to the people in the house and the people who ran toward it. Neighbors stood in the spill of blue light behind the tape and tried to match the address to their memory of the family. Glenda waving from the porch, Constance lugging groceries and laughing with someone on the phone, Kiara with a backpack, half in, half out of the car, because teenagers never go anywhere in one smooth motion. Michael, with a tool bag and a list. Morning turned the scene the color of paperwork. Evidence markers grew like a field of yellow flowers no one wanted. A mobile command post hummed in the background. Detectives did the thing that looks like pacing and is actually thinking. Front door to hallway, hallway to kitchen, back to the door, turning the night into a sequence that would make sense later on a timeline. Sheriff's officials addressed the press with the voice departments use when what they need is order. This was not random. This was not a mystery intruder. This was, in their words, extremely horrific. A phrase that sounds like an overreach until you've stood in a hallway like that. They told a simple story because the simple story was true. 4 people were shot inside their home. 2 children survived and called 911. A suspect who knew the victims was identified and arrested. The rest would be the slow work of building the case the right way. Inside the house, the science began. Firearm technicians logged casings. Crime scene analysts photographed every surface that might tell the sequence of movement. Shoe prints, transfer on a door frame, a scuff that means someone turned hard in fear. Medical examiners took custody of the bodies with the tenderness of people who understand that dignity is not a nicety. It's part of the job. A chalk outline is a movie prop. The real work is quieter and infinitely more precise. Angles, distances, residues. The math of violence turned into a language a courtroom can understand. Outside, the neighborhood learned a new way to stand and speak. Reporters with soft voices asked for what they could not get in full and were given the next best things. Descriptions of a family that still felt present. Glenda's patience, Constance's humor, Kiara's music bleeding through her headphones when she forgot the rest of the world could hear it. Michael's habit of waving at the same neighbors every time like every pass was the first. People left flowers at the fence because that is what hands can do on days when words do not work. By afternoon, the story was national for the worst of reasons. A father accused of killing his 15-year-old daughter, the girl's mother and grandmother, and the partner who stood with them all under one roof before dawn. The boys were praised quietly by the sheriff for their courage. The department did what it could to put care around them immediately, because child survivors carry more than a single morning. The timelines and news updates stabilized. Shortly after 1 a.m., Canaveral Groves, Allen Shepherd Avenue, 4 dead, 2 children called 911, suspect arrested, motive under investigation. The anchor read the words with the calm you practice when you know that calm is the only steady thing you can offer a viewer whose heart is in their throat. If you are listening for how a case like this begins, this is it. It begins with a street that now belongs to a headline, a call from the smallest voices in the house, and a room full of professionals turning a family's worst night into a chain of evidence. It begins with grief that shows up as logistics. Who watches the boys right now? Who calls the aunties? Who drives to the scene? And who stays behind to receive the people who will come and sit in the living room? Because sitting is faith too. It begins with a suspect in custody and a community that cannot square the distance between porch light ordinary and what deputies found when they crossed the threshold. In the next part, we'll move beyond the tape line. We'll track the arrests that followed those first frantic hours, the early statements about what pushed a relationship to the edge, the charges that landed, and how a Florida prosecutor read this file and decided to seek the heaviest sentence the law allows. But before we do, hold the house as it was the day before. Hold Glenda, Constance, Kiara, and Michael in the order their names were spoken to the press because order matters. Hold 2 little boys who did the right thing faster than most adults could have. And hold a street whose name you'd only ever heard in a space race context, now carrying the weight of a family that should have been allowed to keep living their ordinary life in peace. By morning, the facts had settled into something the county could say out loud without breaking them. 4 people were dead in the little ranch on Allen Shepherd Avenue. 2 small boys had reached out for help in the darkness. A 911 call came in around 1:55 a.m., and the first deputies who crossed the threshold found what one of them later called the hardest kind of room to stand in. The sheriff's office didn't try to dramatize it. They didn't need to. They said the simplest version: this was not random. This was targeted. And within hours, they had a name. The name was already known to the house. Domenico Claude Gigante, 36 years old, lived in Rockledge, 15 miles south. He was not a stranger to the Terwilliger family. He was the father of 15-year-old Kiara, and he had a history with Constance that had frayed long before this night. Neighbors remembered him as a presence that came and went, the kind of man who could turn a sidewalk greeting brittle without raising his voice. Inside the sheriff's office, detectives turned the night into a sequence. A car that arrived while most of the neighborhood slept, a front door that should have been a boundary and wasn't, a series of shots that moved from room to room, and then the retreat, back to the car, out to the road, the children alive behind, the house going suddenly quiet. A thing like this does not happen in a vacuum. In the days that followed, the public learned what investigators saw quickly: relationship history that read like a warning in chapters. Deputies and prosecutors described a violent past stretching back years. Assaults, threats. A file thick with the kinds of incidents that make you ask how many chances a person should get to be on the right side of a front door. Friends of the family said the quieter parts. A father who had tried to reinsert himself into a teenager's life. A teenager who had a right to say no. A mother who did the work of protecting boundaries because that's what mothers do. Out of that tension, detectives said, came a man angry enough to cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. The timeline of the arrest was fast. Deputies canvassed through dawn, gathered statements, and followed the route south. Rockledge patrol units were waiting for the nod. When it came, they surrounded the house, where Gigante had last put his head down. He did not run. He did not confess. He simply stepped into a process that had already decided the next hours for him. Cuffs, a ride, a holding room under harsh light with a camera that blinks red every few seconds, and questions asked in the flat tone investigators learn to use when emotion is a luxury they can't afford. At the same time, other detectives were talking to people who knew him best in the last few months. One of them described a man who talked about violence as if it were a plan and not a possibility. Another repeated words no one should ever have to hear: "I'm going to kill them." In the simplest terms, the case in those first 24 hours had a spine: motive, means, opportunity, and a vanishingly small chance that anyone else could have done this. Charges came quickly and came heavy. 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. Not second-degree heat of the moment, not manslaughter, premeditated. The sheet added armed burglary, because crossing a threshold with a gun and leaving 4 people dead is not just murder inside a home. It is entering to kill. At first appearance, the judge did what judges do when a file looks like this: no bond. A reading of rights no one in the gallery really hears, and dates that acknowledge the difference between the speed of grief and the speed of court. The sheriff called the scene extremely horrific, a phrase that sounds like a flourish until you've seen what multiple gunshot homicides inside a small house do to the surfaces, the air, and every person who has to move through that air to tell the truth later. Out on Allen Shepherd Avenue, flowers and candles appeared against the fence. Reporters kept their distance and asked the questions they're paid to ask. Was there a restraining order in the past? Had the sheriff's office been called to this address before? Did anyone see a car leaving? How did the children survive when 4 adults didn't? The answers were careful because they had to be. Investigators confirmed the shape of the motive without pretending to know what goes on in a man's head at the moment. he decides to make a family pay for a boundary. They spoke instead about pattern, about a strained relationship with a daughter who would not pretend a history didn't exist, about frustration that turned into obsession, about a night in which anger arrived armed and made a home into a crime scene. The boys who reached for help were kept deliberately off stage, their names withheld, their courage acknowledged in the spare, respectful way cops use when they know the public wants to applaud. But the children need privacy more than praise. The department wrapped services around them: medical checks, trauma counseling, the logistics that keep a child's day from collapsing after everything else has. Extended family gathered the way families do when shock is still buzzing in every muscle. Someone to field calls, someone to handle the paperwork of death, someone to open the front door and hold a line against curiosity disguised as concern. Bit by bit, the picture filled out. Gigante had shown up at the house and moved through it, shooting Glenda and Constance and Michael, and then Kiara, the child who was also legally and humanly his. It is a sentence the law can say, but no one can understand. Detectives traced his route back to Rockledge and logged the time he returned. Somewhere in those hours there was a conversation with someone who had heard too much in the weeks prior. A roommate or friend who had listened to talk that sounded like threats and later sounded like admissions. That conversation became part of the affidavit the state would rely on when a grand jury read this file and decided whether to indict on the heaviest charges Florida keeps. When the sheriff stood behind a bank of microphones that afternoon, the message was simple and not subtle. He called Gigante an extremely violent individual with a history that should have kept him far from a home like the Terwilligers. He said what many in law enforcement say too often: he should never have been on our streets. The point, beyond anger, was to prepare the public for what prosecutors would likely do next. Take the case to a grand jury, secure first-degree charges, and then consider whether to seek the death penalty. In Florida, 4 premeditated murders inside a dwelling, one of the victims a child, and multiple victims in a single criminal episode are exactly the kind of aggravating circumstances prosecutors cite when they tell a court they intend to seek the ultimate sentence. The bailiff led Gigante back through a door at first appearance, and the process folded around him like a machine closing. The jail roster listed no bond. The docket added a date. Outside, the neighborhood tried to learn a new way to move through the day. People who had seen Glenda every morning watering the strip of grass in front of the fence stood looking at the same patch of ground as if it could answer something. At the high school, they announced counselors would be available and kept them available quietly for as long as students came. Friends of Kiara posted the same selfies twice, one caption from before, one from after, because it felt like a way to hold the time when her name wasn't spoken in past tense. The file grew thicker with the work the public never sees. Ballistic comparisons went to the lab. Casings were matched to a firearm path. Residue tests were processed. The 911 audio was logged and copied to Discovery. Deputies wrote and rewrote their reports until the verbs were exact, because verbs carry weight in homicide. A relative's call, the boy's words, the first deputy's description, the sequence of rooms. Each line a hinge, the case would swing on when a defense attorney started looking for doubt. Meanwhile, the state attorney's office began drafting the notice of intent they would file if they chose to pursue death, a document that lists the reasons a jury could be asked to consider the harshest penalty Florida can impose. And still, in all that noise and paper, the important things stayed small and human. Glenda was 63 and the house's spine. Constance was 35 and the day-to-day engine. Michael was 36, and the second pair of hands a life like this always needs. Kiara was 15, young enough to be called a kid, old enough to have learned to set a boundary and keep it. Two little boys did the brave, practical thing at a moment when most adults would have crumpled. A street with a space race name was turned into shorthand for a kind of horror that won't stop echoing for a long time. Crimes like this move in two languages at once. Outside, there's the human version. Porch flowers, a fence line no one looks at for long, the smallest boys in the house being called brave in the quiet way cops reserve for children. Inside the justice system, there's the legal version. Verbs and numbers that sound cold because they have to hold up under weight. Within a month of the shootings on Allen Shepard Avenue, that second language caught up with the first. The first step was a room with 12 strangers. A Brevard County grand jury listened to the timeline detectives had stitched together through the night and through the days after. The car in the dark, the threshold crossed, the shots moving room to room, the retreat to Rock Ledge. The conversations before and after that made the night look less like a snap and more like a plan. Grand juries don't decide guilt. They decide whether the state has enough to say so out loud in open court. They decided it did. The foreperson signed a true bill listing 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and armed burglary of a dwelling. On a single page, the state had written the law's version of what the sheriff had already said in plain speech. This was intentional, targeted, and carried out inside a home. Arraignment came next, one of those short hearings that feel bigger than they look. The defendant stood in jail clothes flanked by counsel while a clerk read the indictment's title line, State of Florida versus Domenico Claude Gigante. The judge confirmed identity, rights, and the charges themselves. 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, 1 count of burglary with an assault or battery while armed. There was no suspense about bond. No bond had been the rule since the first appearance. It stayed that way. Dates were set. Discovery, police reports, 911 recordings, lab results, scene photos began to flow from prosecutors to defense in packets that arrived like tides. What mattered next was not a hearing, but a filing. Quiet paper with a very loud meaning. The state attorney's office served notice that in this case, the law's ceiling would be the aim. They would seek the death penalty. Florida requires prosecutors to lay out aggravating circumstances, the reasons a jury could lawfully choose death over life. The notice pointed to what any reader of the case would see. Multiple victims, in a single criminal episode, a child among the dead, and killings committed during a burglary, i.e., inside a home entered for the purpose of violence. You don't need to be a lawyer to hear why those facts matter. In the state's calculus, the law is harshest when the crime is. 4 lives, taken where those lives were supposed to be safest, is the definition of harsh. If you want to know what premeditated means in court, listen to how prosecutors describe time. Not just the moment in a hallway when a trigger is pulled, but the minutes and days before. Words spoken about violent intent, trips driven to a house at an hour chosen for advantage, a gun brought along like a conclusion already written. Detective affidavits filed to support arrest and then to support the grand jury presentation, summarized statements from people around the defendant. A roommate told investigators about threats that didn't sound like venting. After the killings, that same person described admissions that made the distance between talk and action disappear. Add to that the route back to Rockledge traced by cell site pings and cameras, and the state's picture of deliberation sharpened. Defense attorneys learned to watch those same minutes from another angle. In a death penalty case, everything becomes a question. Were the statements reliable? Do the timestamps leave space for alternate routes? Is there any thread that might knock premeditated down to something less? In some cases, they argue mental illness or intoxication. In others, they press hard on contamination of witnesses or tunnel vision by police. At arraignment, none of that is argued in full. It is felt. In the way counsel takes notes on a lab report title or asks for a protective order to view materials without premature release. Simiruspurt, or reminds the court that pretrial publicity can poison a jury pool in a county where people stand shoulder to shoulder at the same grocery store. Meanwhile, the case file kept growing the only way that truly matters in homicide: forensics. Ballistics examiners compared casings and projectiles. Gunshot residue reports came back. Distance and angle analyses started to anchor which shots were fired where. Bloodstain pattern work turned what looks like chaos into a sequence of movement. Who was likely shot first, where bodies fell, whether any victim tried to escape down the hall or into a room that turned out not to be a refuge. Those are hard pages for families to read. They're necessary ones for jurors to hear, to ask 12 people to decide between life and death, or even life without parole and the possibility of parole. You have to take them into the rooms the victims can't leave. In the background of all that paper, the public voice of the case stayed steady. The sheriff called the killings extremely horrific, but he and the prosecutors pared their press language to essentials: 4 victims, 2 surviving children, a suspect with a documented violent past, a grand jury indictment, death penalty notice filed. Reporters filled in context responsibly from prior records, earlier incidents that suggested a pattern of control and violence in the defendant's life long before March 1st. None of that substitutes for proof at trial. It does help a community understand why the state chose to aim at the law's highest rung. What about the people at the center of the file? Glenda, Constance, Kiara, Michael, whose names can get lost when statutes start stacking. In courtrooms that do this well, they aren't lost. Early hearings allowed victim advocates to stand with the family to make sure they had seats, support, and answers about the schedule in a process that can feel like a foreign country. The school district kept counselors available for Kiara's classmates. Neighbors adopted the small tasks that become the scaffolding of grief: mow the strip of grass, carry in the mail, sweep the walk after a storm. The 2 boys who called for help before dawn were kept in a protection bubble so tight it barely had a name in public. Their courage remained the first and last thing investigators mentioned when cameras were on. Legally, Part 3 closes with the case properly framed: an indictment for 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder, a companion count for armed burglary, a defendant held without bond, and a death penalty notice that tells everyone the road ahead will be long and lit by the harshest arguments the system allows. Humanly, it closes with the same 4 names spoken in the same order because order is a kind of respect. Glenda Mae Terwilliger, 63, Constance Marie Terwilliger, 35, Michael Andrew Watson, 36, Kiara Terwilliger, 15. The law will keep talking in its language in the months to come. The town will keep answering in its own: flowers at a fence, a high school that doesn't let her desk get swallowed by the present tense, 2 little boys who were helped to grow in a world that will do everything it can to be kinder than the night they survived. Capital cases don't sprint, they settle in. After the indictment and the death penalty notice, the Terwilliger file moved from headlines to hearings with names that sound like paperwork and are actually where futures are decided: case management, status check, motions calendar. The courtroom grew familiar to the family. Same pews, same hum of the AC, same docket rhythm as other lives passed briefly before the judge: probation violations, thefts, a custody dispute. And then the room quieted when the clerk called the 4 counts that brought everyone here. The defense team did what defense teams must in a death case: expand. A second chair appeared at counsel table, then an investigator, then a mitigation specialist whose job it is to pull every thread of a defendant's life to see what it can explain, if not excuse. Capital litigation is 2 trials welded together: guilt and punishment, and preparation for the second starts the day the first begins. While prosecutors cataloged bullets and timestamps, the defense was already knocking on doors 2 counties away asking teachers and cousins and old bosses about childhood, head injuries, drugs, diagnoses, fights no one called the police about. The law will ask a jury, if it ever gets that far, to weigh not only what happened on a single night, but who the person was in every year before it. Prosecutors, for their part, began the grind that makes premeditated more than a word. Lab reports came back and were followed by supplements. The gunshot residue worksheets turned into conclusions. Ballistics matched casings to a weapon in a language built of striations and likelihoods. Bloodstain mapping froze motion into stills a jury could walk through. Where a victim stood, where they fell, what direction someone moved next. Phone records that had been coordinates on a whiteboard hardened into exhibits with provenance. A custodian from a carrier ready to explain how a handset's whisper becomes a dot on a map. The 911 recordings, children's voices, the unteachable courage of asking strangers for help, were copied to discovery with a protective order that kept them out of the evening news. Then came the motions. A capital case is a stack of them. The defense asked to move the trial out of Brevard County, citing weeks of front-page coverage and evening segments where the sheriff, in plain words, called the killings extremely horrific. Change of venue isn't easy to win in Florida. Judges try voir dire first, trusting 12 strangers to promise they can set aside what they've heard. The defense also asked to wall off Williams Rule evidence, Florida's mechanism for admitting prior bad acts to prove things like motive, opportunity, intent. Prosecutors said some of that history mattered because it stitched pattern to premeditation. Threats spoken before the night, control that curdled into rage. A man who didn't stumble into a house and shoot 4 people but arrived there with the idea already fully formed. There were suppression fights, statements made after arrest, what exactly was asked when Miranda was read, how long the interview lasted, whether fatigue and shock make a difference in a death case the way the defense wants them to. Search warrants were litigated like theses. Probable cause for the Rockledge address, the phone, the car, the clothes, the scrape for DNA. The state answered with paper, affidavits that stacked facts until a neutral magistrate had signed every warrant they served. A hearing on gruesome photographs took up a morning. The defense argued probative value versus prejudice. The judge, as judges do, split the difference. Some images in, some out, all of them under instructions about why jurors were being asked to look. The court protected the children's privacy with a firmness that read like mercy. Their names stayed sealed. Their statements were summarized in filings instead of printed verbatim. If they ever had to speak in the presence of the person accused of killing the people who loved them, it would be in a room designed not to make new harm. Closed-circuit options, comfort items allowed at the witness chair, a prosecutor who never once raised a voice. In the gallery, the family learned how to sit through those arguments without clenching every muscle. They brought water and soft jackets and the habit of leaving the room for a few minutes when the talk got clinical about rooms they could picture in their sleep. Prosecutors filed their aggravators in clean lines, multiple victims in a single episode, a child among the dead, murders committed during a burglary, the homicide of a person under 18. Great risk of death to many. The notice was dry, and the dryness is deliberate. Emotion belongs to families. The state's job is arithmetic and law. Florida's capital sentencing rules are their own curriculum. Judges now instruct that a death recommendation can come from a supermajority of jurors. Mitigation can be any reason a juror finds meaningful at all. The defense team worked that lane hard. Trauma and mental health if present. Substance abuse and frontal lobe talk if the records allowed it. The collision of poverty and bad choices if that was the story. In the penalty phase of a capital trial, biography becomes evidence, and a birth certificate turns into an exhibit. On paper, the calendar filled and slipped. Status dates were set, then continued, because death cases stack obligations. Depositions of lab techs, independent testing of residues, a defense expert's schedule, a prosecutor's trial in another courtroom that ran long. From the family's side of the rail, delay felt like insult. From the file's side, it felt like insulation. Each continuance was another layer of certainty that the wheels were on tight. Away from the docket, the ordinary work of grief continued with its own discipline. The fence on Allen Shepard Avenue caught ribbons in Florida wind. Neighbors retied them when they frayed. A counselor showed up at Kiara's school on days when the calendar made breathing harder. First day back after break, her birthday, the day the yearbook arrived, someone mowed the little strip of grass out front like a promise to keep the place respectable until the law caught up. Two small boys grew a year older under a strange kind of protection, adults who knew when to distract and when to say yes to questions that don't have answers. In hearings that took only minutes, the judge built a map of the trial to come. A month was reserved for jury selection alone because capital voir dire is a world unto itself, asking strangers gentle, exacting questions about life and death without breaking the part of them that still needs to decide facts in the first phase. Another month was blocked for guilt. A third was left open for penalty, should the jury get that far. The lawyers traded outlines without giving away strategy. The state's who, what, where, with exhibits numbered and ready, the defense's why, and who he was, with witnesses alphabetized and flights to book. Through it all, one thing did not change: the names at the center of the file. Every motion ended with them. Every hearing began with them, printed at the top of the docket, a heading the clerk read in a tone that never shifted. Glenda Mae Terwilliger, 63, Constance Marie Terwilliger, 35, Michael Andrew Watson, 36, Kiara Terwilliger, 15. The state spoke for them in the language of elements and aggravators. The family spoke for them by sitting down, standing up, showing up, and refusing to let anyone forget why the room was full. Trials aren't just dates on a calendar. They are rooms that fill with air you can feel. When a capital case finally reaches day one, the courthouse starts earlier than usual. Deputies check badges twice. A line forms outside, quiet and long, because even strangers know to lower their voices when grief is about to be spoken out loud again. Inside, the courtroom resets from the small motions of the past year to the scale of what's coming. Extra chairs for counsel, boxes of exhibits stacked like bricks, a pitcher of water on the witness stand that no one will ever keep full for long enough. Jury selection in a death penalty case is its own landscape. It happens in rows and in small groups, with questions that sound simple and are anything but. Can you follow the law? Can you consider both possible punishments if we reach that stage? Do you know anyone connected to this case? Have you seen coverage that stuck? The judge will say this isn't a test, but it is a measure of whether 12 strangers can sit with facts that will try to bend them and still stand upright when it's time to decide. Prospective jurors will talk about jobs, kids, whether they lock the door twice at night. They will be asked whether they can look at pictures that no one wants to see and still think in terms of evidence rather than instinct. One by one, you can watch courage announce itself in the smallest ways. A "Yes, Your Honor," in a steady tone. A refusal to pretend you haven't already cried about the story at home. A panel is built in days, sometimes weeks, with the patience a case like this demands. Openings are the first time both voices tell the story in the same room. The state will speak plainly. Shortly after 1 a.m. on Allen Shepard Avenue, 4 people were shot inside their home. 2 small boys survived and called 911. The defendant was not a stranger to this house. He came with a gun. He left 4 people dead. And he left behind the connective tissue that trials are made of: casings, angles, residue, footprints, phone pings, Statements before and after that turn talk into intent. They will say the names in order: Glenda, Constance, Michael, Kiara, because order is a kind of respect. They will ask the jury to listen for time. The minutes before, the movement through rooms, the drive away, the dawn that found two boys braver than any child should ever have to be. The defense will ask for attention to possibility. They'll remind jurors that what is charged must be proved, that premeditation has a definition heavier than awful, that the law requires precision. They may ask the jury to watch the state's timeline for seams. Who heard what and when? Which statements came before lawyers? Which memories learned to match headlines? They'll say that words said in anger aren't always blueprints, that people brag about violence they never commit, that admission and rumor are cousins and need a close reading before they're allowed to carry weight. They won't try to make the scene smaller, they'll try to make the question narrower, not whether 4 people died, but what exactly the evidence does and doesn't prove about how the night was decided in a human mind. Then the case shifts to witnesses, and the room becomes a machine that turns days into testimony. First responders go first. What they saw, what they did, what they didn't have time to do. The 911 recording might be played with the speakers turned down low. If the children's voices are in it, the judge will warn the room. People in the gallery will brace in a physical way, hands to faces, eyes to the floor, because there are some sounds you cannot pretend it away. Crime scene analysts will follow. Walking jurors through a house, the jurors will start to know where the hallway bends, how the light falls from the kitchen window at night, the distance between a sofa and the front door, the marks that show panic and the ones that prove movement with purpose. On a screen, diagrams will build, dots, and lines that look clinical and are nothing but human when you remember what they represent. Lab experts will translate chemistry into English. Ballistics will match casings to a pattern. Residue will be mapped. Bloodstain analysts will talk about velocity and direction without forgetting they're describing people. A phone company custodian will authenticate records. A detective will set the timeline in place, frame by frame. The car arriving, the door, the sequence, the departure, the path south, the arrest in Rockledge. A friend or roommate will take the stand, carefully, slowly, and repeat words a jury can lawfully hear about threats before or admissions after. The prosecutor will move like someone crossing a rope bridge. Steady, exact, no sudden sways. Cross-examination will look for places to place doubt. The angle that could have been read 2 ways. The timestamp that depends on a device clock that might have drifted. A hearsay edge that should be trimmed back by the rules. If there is a confession, expect a suppression fight already decided in pre-trial to echo faintly in the way questions are asked. Timing, Miranda, fatigue. If there isn't, expect the defense to lean into silence. What isn't on tape? What wasn't said? What wasn't recovered? If the state plays the 911 call, the defense may ask jurors to remember that terror distorts recollection. If the state leans on statements by a friend, the defense may ask why that friend waited to speak, and what they might gain by speaking now. The point isn't to persuade jurors that nothing happened. It's to persuade them that the law's specific words, premeditated, during a burglary, beyond a reasonable doubt, haven't been reached. When the state says the people rest, the room exhales, and the defense decides whether to call witnesses or rely on cross. In some capital trials, the defense calls experts now about perception under stress, about how digital breadcrumbs can be misread, about the narratives we build after the fact and call memory. In others, they wait for the penalty phase and keep the guilt stage as clean as possible. Either way, the judge's instructions will arrive like a careful map. Jurors will be told what counts as evidence, how to handle sympathy, how to weigh circumstantial proof, how to think about intent as something that can be formed in minutes, not just months. Verdict days have their own weather. The gallery fills early. People who have avoided sitting next to each other sit next to each other without speaking. When the jury files in, the air changes. Everyone can feel it. If the foreperson says guilty as charged, the words hit differently for each count, but the rhythm is the same. 1, 2, 3, 4. If the verdict says something else, lesser included, not guilty on a count. The sound the family makes is the sound families make when the world tilts again, even by a degree. Deputies watch the room because this is when people forget how to sit still. If there is a guilty verdict on first-degree murder, a capital trial stands up for a second time. The penalty phase begins. The jury will hear about aggravators they've already glimpsed, multiple victims, a child among them, murders committed during a burglary. But now set against mitigation, the defense has carried like a stack of fragile plates. Childhood, injuries, mental health, addiction, the hard mapping of a life that produced a person capable of doing what the first phase found he did. Family members of the victims may speak. They will be asked to say small things that weigh more than any exhibit. How Glenda kept the calendar straight. How Constance filled a room with motion and got things done. How Michael's habit was to help first and talk later. How Kiara's laugh arrived before the punchline, and how her friends still save her spot when they sit on a curb. The law will tell jurors to listen to that testimony for harm, not for heat. Jurors will hear it with their whole bodies anyway. Florida now allows a death recommendation by a supermajority rather than unanimity, but the instruction still asks each juror to make a personal moral judgment. The defense will ask for life without parole. The state will ask for death. The jury will go away and sit with the hardest question the system can ask civilians. Whatever they decide, the judge will have the last word. It will be said in a voice trained not to break. Not every case reaches verdict in the same way. Some resolve on the courthouse steps years later, when both sides decide certainty is worth more than the risk of a second trial. Some go the distance and then keep going through appeals that take as long as childhood. However, this one travels that road. The town will keep doing what it learned on the first morning, taking care of the living in ways that don't make the news. That looks like this. A neighbor still mowing the strip of grass by the fence on Allen Shepherd Avenue because tidy is a kind of respect. A high school that keeps a counselor's chair free on days when grief returns without warning. Two boys who grow taller under a net of ordinary kindness, rides, homework help, a coach who knows when to let someone sit the first quarter and warm up later. A family that doesn't have to carry every errand alone. Friends who keep saying the names in the right order: Glenda, Constance, Michael, Kiara. The court speaks in elements and instructions. The town answers in meals, quiet company, and the refusal to let the worst thing be the only thing. When the criminal case finally says its last word, verdict, sentence, or some other closure, it won't fix the hole this left. The law isn't shaped like that. What it can do, at its best, is match the truth, the evidence found, and put a boundary around the person who took 4 lives from a house where those lives were supposed to be safe. The rest belongs to the living, to the rituals that make an address feel human again, to the practice of saying the victims' names first, to the daily decision to turn love into logistics. That is how a family becomes present again, in the place where people still pass on evening walks and nod, and still turn their faces toward the porch as if a voice they loved might answer back. If you want true cases told with care and the victims at the center, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Comment for Glenda, Constance, Michael, and Kiara to honor them, and share this episode responsibly.